Good morning. This is the Sports Betting Study Committee meeting. Thank you for joining us. We have some folks in the, what do we call that? The fan stand. We call it the fan stand. Thank you for joining us. Matthew Kolb, you're Senator Acacia Ram Hinsdale's intern.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for joining us. Jacqueline Posley is the Legislative and Communication Liaison for the Agency of Commerce. No, that was the former agency I worked for the Department of Liquor and Lottery. And then Chris Rice, thank you for joining us. And
hello, everybody. My name is Tim Dublin. I'm a new legislative counselor. Tucker Anderson's colleague, actually.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. I wanted to start a little bit with some housekeeping. My intent for the meeting structure, because we have such defined period of time and a pretty big charge with coming up with a report, I wanted to make sure that these meetings are really productive. So my hope is that each meeting will start with what Senator Sears calls as a guest speaker, otherwise known as a witness. I think here we can call him guest speaker or presenter. And this is someone that we feel can really give us information that we need, answer any questions, and give us the real substantive that will help us get to the how. We decided last meeting that we were on a path to how to implement sports betting in Vermont. And so I thought it would be really helpful to focus those speakers on that. Then we will have obviously a discussion, and then hopefully what we will do at the end of each meeting is really either make some decisions or have some direction based on the information that's presented, the discussion that we have, so that we're arriving at each meeting with some sort of direction or decision that will help inform that report that we submit to the legislature in December 15th. How does that sound to the committee members? Good? Does that sound like a good game plan?
Yes.
Awesome. I see a lot of thumbs up. Thank you. The other thought I had was, I think it would be really important to have a public hearing. I know based on my conversations with Mike that they're a little bit time consuming. I do think it's important since sports betting, we only had a little bit of conversation about it in the legislature. I think it's important to give people an opportunity to talk about their thoughts, their concerns, their experiences, and to have a public hearing. And Mike and I talked about structuring that sometime maybe mid-October to late October after we've had a chance to have a couple of these meetings and then open it up to the public. Hello, Senator. Glad you made it. So does that sound good to everybody to have a public hearing, to have a lot of voices represented in the conversation? Great.
Supportive, yep.
And that concludes the housekeeping portion of the agenda. Tucker, really appreciate you preparing this amazing, you really stepped up the game for presentation materials here. Your regulatory framework, decision points and flowcharts. I felt that this was going to be really helpful to the committee to really identify what those key decision points are. So it would be wonderful if you could walk us through your presentation at this point.
Thank you, Commissioner Knight, and good morning, everyone. Tucker Anderson from the Office of Legislative Counsel. I'll walk you through the presentation, and just as a bit of brief background before we jump into it. First, I prepared this in response to a request from some of the members to have a policy decision matrix or a policy point matrix similar to what the Senate Committee on Economic Development requested in the spring. I prepared this new presentation because what the Senate Committee looked at very specifically was the question, how little can the legislature do and how much can be delegated to the administrative agencies to take care of some of those policy points. So specifically things like security of systems, issues like that, where there's a lot of detail. The question here is maybe a little different. For you all, one of the charges of this committee is to provide a recommendation for legislation. And what the General Assembly was looking at there was, can you have a draft with all of those legislative priorities teed up in the form of a bill? So the presentation is going to walk you through the major decision points that have to be made in creating a regulatory framework for sports betting in Vermont. The next piece of background is historical. I'm going to do it in 30 seconds. So if you have follow-up questions, please let me know and I can give you some detail and maybe prepare some materials for the committee for your next meeting. The first thing to remember is that in the background of all of these regulatory frameworks, casinos, and sometimes racetracks. Many of the states that have implemented and have implemented very quickly these regulatory frameworks had existing structures for wagering in the state. And a lot of what the study that Ledge Council and JFO prepared looked at were those states. And it's a silent component of everything that you're going to look at is that many of these states had existing structures on both sides. The licensure states, you know, those gaming control board models that are discussed in the report, and the control states. And that bleeds into the next piece of historical context, which is the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, which was overturned by the US Supreme Court and spawned all of these state by state models for sports wagering regulation. There are a handful of states, 4 very specifically, that were operating sports wagering through the nationwide prohibition. And when you look at those states, you might determine that the reason they have the models they have is because they were able to operate them for 30 plus years while it was prohibited nationwide. So when you look at Nevada, Delaware, Montana, those states had existing structures. And the way that PASPA worked was that they were allowed to have those operational models, but they weren't allowed to add anything new. They had to keep it the way it was. So that's why, for example, you might see a lot of retail sports wagering in some of these states, because a state like Delaware was operating sports wagering through its state lottery and couldn't add or reduce anything. So one of the things they did was push out sports wagering to their lottery retailers in the form of physical kiosks. So with all that background, let me share this so that we can move through the presentation together. Something to get out of the way initially before we start moving through the discussion of the framework is discussing what is sports wagering. Ultimately, these are things that are going to be defined in the statute that the General Assembly passes, if the General Assembly passes. But in general, the product that we're talking about is actually an agreement. It's effectively a contract between the bettor and the sports book that has a contingency. If X happens, we pay you. If X doesn't happen, you pay us. And there's, you know, a formula there for how much you win or how much you lose, depending on what the contingency is. So there isn't a thing that we're dealing with, right? This is a value-added experience. So what is the thing? That's something else that has to be defined by the legislature. The thing is a sporting event, and that's defined a little differently state by state. Some states include college athletics, some do not. But in general, you're talking about an event that happens and then contingent on some sort of detail happening, a win, a loss, a player scoring 40 or more points. The contingency comes into effect and either the bettor wins or loses. And this is important because I felt like I didn't do a good job during the first meeting of presenting to you why fan engagement has been really important in some of the states. The reason it's important is because what the person is consuming really is a sporting event. So many states have looked at fan engagement and are trying to drive the consumer towards the product, which is an NFL game, an NBA game, whatever it might be. So moving in, the primary decision, and this is where a lot of the robust discussion over the last 3 or 4 years has happened in the General Assembly. Is Vermont going to stay a prohibitionist state? The report highlights that we are in a prohibitionist phase with the exception of fantasy sports contests, which are registered with the Secretary of State and are currently not taxed and regulated. That puts a lot of pressure on law enforcement. Law enforcement is really the only arm that the state uses in a prohibitionist model to come at sports wagering. The next model, state control. This is the model that New Hampshire uses, the hybrid model that Rhode Island uses as a couple examples. This is where the state plays an active role in operating the sports wagering market, whether that's through a lottery. As I discussed, Delaware operates the lottery state control model, where sports wagering is a lottery game, or whether that is through exclusive rights contracts or franchises. And the model that I highlighted last time was New Hampshire, where there is an exclusive rights franchise with a single operator. The New Hampshire Lottery controls sports wagering, and it operates it through a platform provider, which is DraftKings. The next big model that you look at is a licensed market. The majority of the states that operate sports wagering do so through licensure. The state operates a licensing program. You have applicants come in. Often there are limits or caps on the number of operators that may enter the market. That is usually a strategic decision, a barrier to entry that is set up for 3 reasons: to try to get as much money to stay in state as possible, right? So the primary licensees are usually casinos that then have platform providers. The second is to ensure that they're getting qualified applicants. Something that was highlighted for the Senate Committee on Economic Development by some folks who came in to testify was the Wyoming model. Wyoming requires that in order to get a license during the initial phase of their market, you have to be operating in at least 3 other states. That was enacted to make sure that the qualified and experienced applicants were coming in out of the gate. And the final reason for establishing some of those licensure qualifications as a barrier to entry is to try to make sure that the handle, the expected revenue from people placing bets, is maximized for licensees, so that they are making enough money and generating enough revenue as a licensee to pay taxes. The more losses you have as an operator, the less money the state is going to make. So you'll see, if you go through the excellent analysis that JFO put together at the end of the report, that the number of licensees operating in the market does have some impact on the expected revenue that is generated. I'll quickly go through the models. If you have questions, please interrupt me. I love to hear myself talk. So give me a reason to pause. In a controlled market model, you effectively have 2 different styles that I've already covered: the lottery and then the exclusive contract or franchise. Under the lottery model, the state would likely have to amend its existing lottery statutes to authorize sports wagering games. Sorry, my dog really wanted to be involved in this discussion.
I thought somebody was snoring already.
No, it's a very itchy Australian Shepherd. So then determine whether the state is going to create its own system or operate through a platform provider. And if you look through the report and some of the revenue statistics in the tables, you'll see that the states that decided to create their own systems, by and large, have not had as much launch success as states that use platform providers. And I would urge you to take a look at the District of Columbia as an interesting example, where they have a hybrid where they do license some entities, particularly those tied to sports franchises, to operate their own sports wagering platforms. But DC has control outside of those physical locations and developed its own application. And there have been some launch struggles there that I would encourage you to take a look at. Under the exclusive contracts and franchise agreement model, the state establishes essentially competitive bidding procedures. In the states that have established those procedures, those are typically set in statute, at least the minimum standards directing the agency on how to negotiate those contracts and review the bids. The state also establishes minimum contract requirements This may be, for example, establishing minimum fees or taxes that have to be paid before the market can be stood up. It may also be, the requirement, for example, in Connecticut, of an annual contribution to a responsible gaming fund. Next, establish limitations, minimums, or caps on the number of franchisees or vendors. This was part of the discussion in the Senate this year. Should there be a minimum number of licensees if Vermont is going to operate a control market? Should there be a cap on the number of licensees that are allowed to operate? Again, it's an important discussion because it has a direct impact on the growth and revenue in the market. The licensed market. And again, casinos, and racetracks. When you look at the licensure models and the breakdown in the report, a lot of these, what are known as tiered licensure models, relate directly to the existence of casinos in the states. So in a casino, you have what are known as key employees and licensed employees. They're handling a lot of money. They have a lot of direct responsibility where the state has an interest in monitoring and regulating the person. And that's why you see employees under the licensure system. It may not be as important in a state that does not have casinos, racetracks, or other wagering employees already here. So I didn't move through the flow for that. Or the next level, which are suppliers, management, service providers, and other ancillary licensees. Suppliers supply equipment. Unless you determine that you want retail wagering, which is going to a kiosk or appearing at a teller's window and sliding a filled out piece of paper across to submit your wager, suppliers, some of those management service providers, may not be a licensing component that Vermont has to consider. So the big piece, primary licensees, operators, and platform providers. These are the licensees that will be operating the sports book, offering sports wagering in the state. These are the applications that are run by the sportsbook operators when we talk about platform providers. So we're talking about those that you've heard of, FanDuel or DraftKings or Caesars or Barstool. That's what we're talking about when we talk about a licensed operator and platform provider. Different models that you can take a look at. No enumerated cap on licensure. That means that the state does not establish a default barrier to entry. You open the market. Senator Sears.
Yeah, just a question about the groups who are active. Are they all United States based? Could they be from foreign countries that are licensed in various states?
So that doesn't appear in the state by state laws and regulations. And the reason that I believe it doesn't appear there is that that would be an issue of federal law as to whether, a foreign entity could operate in a number of states. I will take a look at whether there are any non-US actors in play in the sports wagering markets.
I think Great Britain has had legal sports betting a long time. And I'm not sure how it's operated. For example, could they operate in Vermont if they were one of the licenses?
That's an excellent question. And I actually do have research materials somewhere that take a look at the United Kingdom, Australia, and Denmark as kind of the more mature markets for sports wagering that have a lot of operators. So I can send those materials to you and I'll come back to the next meeting with a response about whether there are foreign operators operating in some of the states.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So wrapping up the caps on licensure, sometimes there are default qualification limits. So if you move through the report, the very first state that's covered in the report is Arizona. They do not have an enumerated cap. They don't say we're only going to have 8 operators. What they do say is the only entities that can acquire a license in the state of Arizona are a National Football League organization that has a stadium in the state, a PGA Tour location, a NASCAR racetrack, or a professional sports franchise based in Arizona. And then those licensees can choose platform providers to offer sports wagering in Arizona. So while they don't say we're only going to issue 8 licenses within the state, by default, there's a limited number of entities that can acquire those primary licenses and then operate a sports book within Arizona. So different examples of how you can establish those initial barriers to entry there. All right. No matter which model you choose, cap, no cap, open market, whatever it might be, the next kind of big decision point is how to establish the application and qualification process. While there are still some considerations around barriers to entry there and determining how to qualify applicants that enter the state, typically the application and qualification process, both for the licensees and for their primary or key employees, so their ownership interests, is very similar state by state. So you can take a look at almost any of the licensure states and get a good understanding of what they're requiring. And as far as the owners of a license are concerned, it's typically, do they have any background or history with criminal activity or with interfering with sports integrity? Those are 2 of the primary considerations. Fees. The report looks at fees and essentially comes to the conclusion that there is a huge array of fees that could be applied here. So I think it's something like $250 to $25 million is the range. So looking at the scope, potentially one of the things this committee may want to take into consideration is how much might it cost the state to administer sports wagering, particularly if it's the licensure model, and how much of that can be recouped through a fee. That's how, in my experience, most of the fees established by the General Assembly operate, is recouping the costs of monitoring and enforcement. Mm-hmm. The next consideration is compliance review, suspension and revocation processes. Because, in the previous model we looked at on state control, you have a contract or a franchise between the 2 parties that is defining how they relate to each other, how they work with each other. Here you are going to have some sort of quasi-judicial or administrative process in place, or you may just require an agency to put those procedures in place for how licensee behavior is going to be reviewed, under what circumstances may their license be suspended, and when and how may a suspension or revocation be appealed. You have some due process considerations there. So then we get into some of the details, and I'm not going to spend too long here, but I went through the major blocks of detailed decisions that may have to be made, not necessarily in the legislation, but at some point, whether that be in rule or guideline by the agency. Background checks, periodic reviews, and reporting for licensees, requirements for auditing, integrity monitoring, and reporting of irregularities. Pause there and say that all of the states have been very careful about the relationship between, like I said, the thing, which is the sporting event, and then the product, which is this value-added experience. Are there impacts on the sporting events that the agency needs to monitor and be careful of? So later I'll talk about consumer protection and product regulation, but there are types of bets that have a higher risk of causing integrity issues with a sporting event. Typically those that are based on the outcome of the game. And then the flip side of that is that when you're talking about irregularities, betting irregularities that are targeting the integrity of the actual betting system, that's where the types of bets that don't have an impact on the outcome of the game. So for example, what color Gatorade will be poured on the coach at the end of the game, that has no impact on the outcome of the game, but it might be capable of being manipulated by outside parties. And that's something that has to be monitored. Okay, consumer protection requirements for the wagering platform. What is the operator required to do in order to provide notice and protections to those who are using the platform? An enormous consideration, if a priority for the committee and eventually the state, is responsible gaming. House rules, minimum internal
Tucker,
controls.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I ask a quick question about that?
Absolutely.
So how does Legislative Council view the existing consumer protection requirements of Title IX with respect to fantasy sports, and how that may or may not apply to sports betting generally? Of course, I'm referring to 9 VSA 4186.
I don't have a view prepared that I can share with you. I'll walk you through some of the big consumer protection considerations in the sports wagering world. One of the key differences that I noted when I was looking at what exists in Title IX and what these other states are doing with sports wagering is that this type of wagering can be done anywhere. It can be done rapidly, and it is attractive to a younger population that, at least according to researchers that are involved with responsible gaming entities, is more at risk in that age category for developing gambling behavior disorders. So the consumer protection models that have been enacted, particularly recently and in the Northeast, aim at providing information to the consumer that directly attacks the informational asymmetry that exists in mobile and online sports wagering. So that would be, for example, required notices about house rules. Here are the terms of how you might be paid. Here are the terms about when you can walk back a bet based on information you've received prior to the start of the event. A lot of procedural notices and a lot of warnings about use of the application. So for example, Connecticut has a requirement for some pop-ups and applications to tell the bettor how long they've been on the platform and how much they've wagered within a given time period. So there's very specific statutory requirements as opposed to some of the provisions of Title IX in the fantasy sports contest statutes.
Thank you.
Finally, looking at accounting procedures and the collection of taxes. And I listed this broadly, but this could be, for example, are there offsets that an operator is allowed to apply to their tax reporting? So the Senate committee heard about the pros and cons of allowing for advertising and promotional credit to be deducted from the reported gross revenue. Another thing to keep in mind is the accounting period, and when the gross revenue is calculated may have an impact on how much of the revenue stream travels to the state during a given period, because this market will fluctuate. There will be huge revenue months, and then there may be months with pretty significant dips. So something to keep in mind as you move into tax discussions. Secondary decisions to keep in mind as you move forward. The first one, which is going to be a fairly quick discussion, just to tee up your further consideration research. Is this going to be a retail state, an online and mobile state, or both? So retail, that is physical assets, the kiosks, sports lounges, where people appear in person to place their bets. Is this going to be an online and mobile state, mobile applications, or is it going to be both? And the model you choose may have, downstream impacts on whether or not you want to use either or both. Next, organizing and balancing the state's interests. Establishing priorities within the legislation is going to be important. And the message here is going to be that it's likely that you can't have it all. There's going to be some give and take with how robust and liquid the market is, with the type of principles or institutional values you bake into the statutes. So for example, we're talking about consumer protection. There are some consumer protection models that simply say you can't offer this type of bet in the state. That's an institutional principle you may apply that will have an impact on the type of products that can be sold and the type of revenue that can be generated by the operators. Regulatory levers and administrative authority. What tools can you give the administrative agency or agencies that are going to be working in this area to make sure that they can respond quickly? There's a lot of research from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas about the Nevada model. They have an incredibly robust and responsive administrative scheme. Regular checkups on qualifications, regular reviews, but again, a very, very mature, robust market where they can support those regulatory levers. There may be a lot of lessons that you can take from Nevada on how to build the strength of the agencies and make sure that they're responsive to the market and the operators. Consumer protection and product limitations. I already touched on that, so we'll zip through. Taxes and potential designation of the revenue. What is the tax rate going to be? Is this going to be a revenue sharing agreement if you use the control state model? And what is that rate going to be? And again, the sensitive component that you're tinkering with in this area is how are you impacting the handle of the operator? Operator revenues are going to be the state revenues. So there are very thin margins sometimes in this area. So if you set the wrong tax rate or potentially are the first state to adopt a progressive tax rate, that could build uncertainty into the margin of the operator. It could increase their risk profile. If you don't have a high enough tax rate, maybe the system doesn't pay for itself. So there's a lot of considerations there. Final component in the secondary decision, responsible gaming. What type of responsible gaming measures are going to be required for the operator, and what is the state going to offer? Two partners in that area. For retail wagering, you're looking at physical locations and systems. Some of the considerations you may have, there's going to be additional security requirements once you're dealing with physical assets and physical locations. So you're not just talking about the digital assets. In both retail and mobile wagering, you have technological security requirements for the systems, right? A kiosk is going to be communicating with the server. So you have shared security concerns there. Retail has its own set. Surveillance, location of systems, things like that. You've got qualifications for retail locations and agents. How are you going to review the folks that are actually staffing and manning the locations? The potential need for separate payment and accounting systems when you're talking about retail wagering. Usually you're dealing with an actual ticket. You're also talking about cash boxes. So you have counting that has to happen. You're also going to have to think about whether or not credit cards and debit cards will be accepted if you're dealing with kiosks. Additional licensing compliance and inspection requirements. Again, because you actually have physical assets out there, you're going to have additional compliance and inspection costs associated with it, going out to those locations, performing the sort of routine checkups, having access to those locations consistently. For mobile and online wagering, the concern around security is that it needs to be adaptive. So you have to have adaptive standards from the agency because the technological aspect of this is likely to change very rapidly. And there are annual standards that are published by the gaming license industry that take a look at standards and best practices for system security. This mobile and online wagering focuses primarily on qualifications for operators and platform providers to try to build that market. And there's a concern there because if Vermont adopts some standards that are dramatically different than other states, Vermont has just added barriers and costs that may impact the market. Potential need for payment and customer account standards, another concern. So the Senate committee heard some testimony about how credit card transactions can impact gambling behavior and how that's balanced with access to the product for the customer. On the compliance side, the benefit to mobile and online wagering is that it's centralized. So you have a centralized compliance and monitoring system, particularly if you have fewer licensees and a direct relationship between that robust administrative agency and the licensee. So moving on to organizing and balancing state interests. One of the primary tasks may be, at least at this initial phase, figuring out what is going to be important for the state. What are the pillars going to be? What's the hierarchy? What's the priority? So big pillar, converting the illegal market. One of the goals to reduce or eliminate criminal activity, to increase security for the consumer. So one of the concerns that the Senate has heard about over the last 3 years over and over again is if there is illegal or illicit wagering happening now, it's happening offshore. People are putting their money into these accounts with offshore operators, and there is absolutely no protection or guarantee if they win that they're going to get their money or that they're going to get any of the money that they wagered back at any point. So, security for consumers. Establishing a taxable base to support responsible gaming services. The lottery currently contributes, Commissioner, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's $100,000 annually to responsible gaming services. I believe they're based out of Stowe. So states have looked at how do we pay for our responsible gaming services, and one of the answers is growing the legal market for wagering and contributing a share to responsible gaming. Consumer protection. How do you confront the informational asymmetry between operators and consumers? One party knows a lot more about the odds than the other party does. How does that get confronted? Through a consumer protection model. Controlling products to address sports and wagering integrity, which we've talked about, the impacts on vulnerable populations, and the influence over gambling behaviors. Finally, establishing notice and education for consumers entering the wagering market. So if any of those three are important, consumer protection might be a very important goal for the bill that eventually gets put together. Fan engagement and support for in-state or regional franchises. This is one where Vermont might have a difficult time balancing its priorities. And the reason is that name a major in-state sports franchise that people may be betting on. The only one that I can think of immediately would be University of Vermont sports. But many states have decided not to permit wagering on in-state athletics. If that's the course that Vermont takes, how is that going to balance in-state fan engagement with the decision to protect the integrity of in-state college athletics? So, encouraging market to engage with established in-state resources, huge concern for Arizona, as we touched on, and driving consumer interaction with sports leagues and franchises in general, making sure that the product is helping grow that liquid market. Establishing strong and responsive administrative authority. This is building that kind of robust regulatory lever, right? Focusing on those administrative levers that allow for strong and responsive partnerships, and structuring the delegated authority to allow the agency to quickly adapt. This was the primary pillar that the Senate looked at this spring. How could a statute be put in place that would make, in that instance, the Department of Liquor and Lottery strong and responsive and capable of operating the market directly moving forward without having the legislature come back repeatedly to grant new authority so that they could respond to the challenges of the market? There are some risks in the administrative end of this that you can look at in the report. It's covered in the beginning in the regulatory models, but there are essentially 4 areas of regulatory failure that come up repeatedly in wagering regulation. So if you take a look at those, at minimum, maybe this pillar is just avoiding the potential for those failures, if not creating the most robust and strong administrative authority in the country. The final consideration here that you need to balance is revenue. And revenue is the most influx aspect of this. As you make choices in the other areas, it may have a significant impact on revenue. And you will likely need to hear from some experts about experiences in other states when some of those legislative or regulatory levers get put in place. How does that impact the liquidity of the market? And one of the things that I noted in the report is that particular attention has been paid since 2018 to what's known as launch failures. What decisions are made up front that cause the market, when it stood up, to not have an enormous launch that drives consumer engagement and excitement about the product? If you don't have that successful launch, sometimes those initial stuttering steps have dramatic long-term effects on state revenue. Establishing the administrative authority, primary thing to consider here, is this going to be centralized or decentralized? Are you going to have one agency run everything, or are you going to have multiple expert agencies taking care of discrete tasks? An example of when this came up in the Senate was that there's testimony that routine studies about problem gambling and access to problem gambling resources, testimony was given that probably should not come from the agency that actually offers sports wagering if you use the control model, that it should come from a separate entity. And in that case, it was the Department of Mental Health. Balancing statute and administrative rules. How much of this is going to be baked into the statute? Hard line requirements for the administrative agency to follow. How much of this is going to come from the agency itself? So is there going to be broadly delegated authority, or is this going to be narrow channels that the stream of power moves through? Are these going to be APA rules? Is this going to be a longer process? Or is the decision going to be similar to what the Senate looked at, which is establishing a shorter timeline, potentially through guidelines? So setting up the statute to tell the agency how to regulate itself in its relationship with operators. Existing versus new administrative structures. So the bill initially, as it was introduced in the Senate, that dealt with sports wagering in the last biennium, created a division in the Department of Liquor and Lottery that was only going to look at sports wagering. Ultimately, it was determined that that wasn't necessary by the time that the bill was being worked on by Senate Economic Development, but it's a consideration here. Are you going to have specialized divisions that are taking care of the market? Consumer protection and product limitations. The who's, what's, when's, and how's. Who can participate in sports wagering? What is Vermont's minimum age requirement going to be? 18 or 21? Majority of states are 21. There are a number of those out there that allow 18-year-olds to wager. Is it going to be something in between? Are minors going to be permitted to enter the market? Exclusion of particular persons. Who are prohibited players going to be? Athletes, employees of the operators themselves, referees, coaches, trainers, employees of the Department of Liquor and Lottery. Are there going to be default exclusions for people interacting with the product? And then self-exclusion options. What are the options for a person to say to either the administrative agency or the operator, I cannot play this game for X number of months or indefinitely until I go through an appeal process to take myself off the list. What are the products that the operator may offer? The things, right, or the agreements. Integrity exclusions and mechanisms. So again, looking at those products that might impact the sports integrity. And there's a mechanism that 7 or 8 states have implemented so far, where the leagues can reach out to the operators or the administrative agency and say, we have concerns about the potential for this upcoming event to be manipulated. It is susceptible. Please do not allow wagering on that product. Specific exclusion for prohibited sports events. So these are typically in the statute. The most common that we see, high school sports and in-state athletics. There are also exclusions for certain types of sports events that are regulated federally. One that comes up frequently is highlight. So you'll see a lot of exclusions in the report for highlight.
What is that?
Why?
What is highline?
Highlight is the game where a surprising number of individuals actually die, but it's, you see that scoop, that handheld scoop, and the small, almost racquetball style ball, but it's very hard. And the ball gets thrown at excess of like 120, 130 miles an hour out of that scoop against a wall. And then it's caught and returned. Very similar to racquetball, but for some reason, there are a lot of exclusions around it, and I believe some federal regulation, which is why it gets excluded. So if you look at the Connecticut analysis in the report, Connecticut has an explicit exclusion for highlight. So excluding types of wagers, most of the states allow every type of wager to take place. The majority, I'll say, allow anything to take place. So you'll come across terms like proposition bets, in-play bets, parlays. There are a lot of different type of wagering products in this market. There are some states that have taken the step to exclude some of them, either over integrity concerns or consumer protection concerns. When may a consumer be prevented from accessing the product? So for example, is the state going to require wagering time notices like Connecticut has? For self-exclusion, is it going to be an indefinite list that the state keeps of people who say, I don't want to play, please don't let me play? Or is this going to be that the person can exclude themselves for 2 months and then have an opportunity to use the application or the wagering system again? How may a consumer participate? So notice and consent requirements, including the acceptance of house rules. And on the topic of house rules, is Vermont going to be a state where house rules must be submitted to the administrative agency and reviewed before they can be implemented by the operator? And the concern there is around, a barrier for the operator to amending house rules to fit new products and to introduce new products to the market. Exclusion of payment types, establishment of deposit limitations. These are all responsible gaming mechanisms that can be built in. And if you go back and review, I believe what the National Council on Problem Gaming submitted with respect to the Senate's work in the spring, they provided some testimony around how credit cards do cause some concerns because it's essentially allowing an individual to accrue debt in order to place wagers. Taxes. Taxes or revenue shares, are they going to be flat or progressive? There are no progressive tax structures yet in the state systems. That is because it builds an enormous risk profile for operators if they don't know how much of the margin is being shared with the state. What will the tax rate be and how will this impact overall and per capita revenue for the state? Look through the JFO section of the report. You'll see that as the tax rate moves up and down, it has impacts on the market, which has impacts on revenue. This is a big one. How do you define what the revenue of the operator is? Are they going to be allowed to deduct promotional credits? Big question. What is the agency that's going to collect the tax? How frequently is it collected? Again, I already covered how there are concerns there. And is the state going to designate where the funds will be deposited and appropriated? If you go to the last section for each state in the report, you'll see that the very last paragraph will talk about some of the statutory and in 4 cases, constitutional requirements for where the money goes. The big note here is that if it's in statute, it's not permanent. It's more of a policy directive to say this is where we want the money to go, but it can always be overridden. So unless you want to propose a constitutional amendment, this is not going to be a permanent mandate for where money gets designated. Responsible gaming, I highlighted for you here, and this is the last slide, mercifully, for all of you.
Great job, Tucker. Great job. Really helpful.
The duality here, the state plays a role, the operator plays a role. How are you going to define what they're going to be providing and what their duties and responsibilities are with respect to responsible gaming? So what are the resources that the state's going to provide and it's going to be available to consumers by default? Who's going to provide the responsible gaming services? Are you going to ask an administrative agency to provide the services, or are you just going to dedicate money to a nonprofit, a non-state actor to make sure that those resources are available? So for example, who's going to operate the 1-800 hotline for gambling addiction? Who will provide, will the state require periodic studies or reporting? This is a question that came up in the Senate, so I made sure to include it here. There are 4 or 5 states that require, for example, every 2 to 3 years, a responsible gaming study to be conducted. Iowa requires a comprehensive responsible gaming study to be conducted every 8 years. Will the state have centralized responsible gaming tools, such as the player exclusion? How much of this is going to be within the administrative agency? And then on the operator side, will the state require operators to provide responsible gaming notices and tools? Some states are lean. Some states require the 1-800 notice and notices about player exclusions and don't apply very many other duties to the operator. Some states have a lot of requirements for operators. Connecticut is the example that I keep going back to. They require very specific technological mechanisms to be put in place to warn and notice players about their gaming conduct on the applications. Finally, will operators be required to receive and report requests for self-exclusion? Most states require operators and the state agency to maintain the self-exclusion lists. That's all I had for the key decision points here. If there are particular areas moving forward that you want some brief analysis on or some more resources, please let me know. So having been invested in this for so long, I have a lot of materials that I could share, and I would be happy to help you drill down or target any of these issues that you see as important.
Thank you, Tucker. That was really helpful. I want to welcome Representative Odie to the meeting. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
So first of all, do we have anyone have any questions for Tucker? Let's see if there are questions for Tucker. This is very helpful, Tucker. Thank you.
I have a few, but Tucker's last point again about Connecticut just raised a visualization question I'm having. If you travel to the state of Connecticut with your platforms on your phone, does it change the notices you receive, or are you a Vermonter using your own app in Connecticut? Like, what changes when you move around the country? I don't quite understand that.
In terms of the notices?
Like, I don't know actually sort of nexus law. Like, are you a Vermont resident everywhere you gamble in the country? Are you paying?
Yeah, I think it's the state you're in, which the geolocation pertains to.
So the answer is something that I glossed over completely and that the report doesn't get into because it's active in all of the mobile states. Geofencing. When you cross when you cross the state border, the application knows where you are and you must comply with the state that you're in, right? So all of the sports wagering states are ring fenced, and not all applications are available in every single state, right? You might have a state like New Hampshire that only uses DraftKings, but if you use DraftKings and you drive into New Hampshire, and fire up that mobile application, it's going to comply with New Hampshire state laws. And if you want details on how that might work, I'm sure that, for example, Chris and the Sports Betting Alliance could get into great detail about how that all works as you move from state to state and what might change.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great question, and that can be addressed by one or two of the operators that we'll have come in to speak about that from a consumer perspective, what happens.
Maybe if they could show us what it looks like in Connecticut, since that keeps coming up, like the extra pop-ups that exist there.
Or if you go from Vermont to Massachusetts to Connecticut, yeah. Other questions for Tuck based on Tucker's presentation? I know you generated a lot of questions. I think for me, sounds like the senator, I think all of us have these questions now, which is kind of where I thought we could move into. So are there specific questions about Tucker's presentation? I think the idea was to give us the broad brush, and then we really, throughout the next couple of weeks, months, dig down. So are there specific questions for Tucker while he's here before we kind of open it up to our discussion?
I think this isn't, oh, sorry.
No, I wasn't sure if I saw a hand raised, no.
So another question I had was just when you asked, when you mentioned that some states, or you can gamble on what color the Gatorade is, like, do some states prohibit questions that just seem like someone could go down a spiral of gambling on everything? I mean, is that a problem gaming question of like, can you just start to bet on every single thing that's happening? Are some of these questions more geared towards kids? Like, what color Gatorade just seems like, can we not allow them to ask questions like that, bet on questions like that?
So there are, like I said, a minority of states that do exclude certain types of bets. And typically those bet exclusions are on the more manipulable, I don't know if that's a word, I'll use it.
Sure, it works.
Sounds good.
Betting types. And they also, in a handful of states, as I mentioned, have the ability, for example, for the sports league or for a college to reach out and say, please exclude this type of bet for these events because there's concerns about either league involvement or outside influence, things like that. From a responsible gaming perspective, I haven't seen any responsible gaming specific tools or regulations that target those kind of discrete betting types, outside of the note that those types of bets do have an impact, right? Because they happen quickly, they can happen in game, right? So some of the studies look at what happens when you have a wagerer who bets on the outcome of the game and is then active in the game as well, making in-game bets, and how that impacts gambling behaviors. And I can take a look through the study again and see if there are states that target that sort of gambling behavior specifically. And a note that I will throw out there is that I used that example because it has come up before. So can you bet on the Gatorade color that gets poured on the coach? It's happened. But there's also, the operators are going to some extent, self-regulate too, because there's risk in the house losing that bet, right? So how likely is it that an operator is going to be able to understand the odds of the Gatorade color? I don't know, but it seems like it would have a high risk profile that would discourage an operator from offering it because they need a lot of predictability in order to maximize the margin of how much the operator is making. So for example, if you're looking at state control models, the state is probably going to be more risk averse than a lot of operators. And you might see in those states that those types of bets never happen. So if you want me to do research on the specific types of bets that have come up and that might have been excluded in the past, I can do so. Or I can direct you to some of the states that have that exclusion mechanism. And you might be able to reach out to their gaming control boards to ask what has been excluded in the past.
So I have a little bit of a follow-up to that. So do the operators, the platforms, will they shut off wagering on a particular event or bet if they're taking too much action on one side of it? I've been told bookies will do that.
I actually don't know the answer to that question.
That might be a question for our operators when they come in, right?
I mean, that could be a red flag that there might be an
Yeah.
issue within the competition itself.
So one, I don't know if this is getting exactly what you're asking, but they do identify betting irregularities. And there are some states that even in their statutes, or in the case of Arkansas, the Constitution delegates directly all of the gambling authority to their racing administration. So the legislature isn't involved at all. And the racing rules do require automatic review of betting irregularities and irregularities in betting amounts, where there's essentially like a pause, there's required registration for certain types of bets, there's a review process, and all of that is to understand why is this irregularity happening. And there are, I want to say, somewhere between 5 to 10 states that require automatic notice of gambling irregularities, whether that's amount or volume, to not only the state, but also to the sporting organizations.
Okay.
So in those states, it might be send a report automatically to the NFL about this game that has some sort of irregularity happening, and to the state, so there can be a quick review. And also an important note to throw out there that there are risk management associations that you might hear about from some of the operators, and I would encourage you to ask about, where there's kind of this coalition of integrity monitoring, where they're looking at, for example, irregularities in betting volume state to state, so that the state operators in this association can understand it may not appear irregular in our state, but in the greater scheme of things, something odd is happening here that we need to monitor and keep an eye on.
Any other questions for Tucker on the specific presentation that he gave? Anyone online have any specific questions? Chris?
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you, Chairwoman Knight. So Tucker, is there, and maybe this is in the report, but I noted it was really a drill down into sort of state by state. And so there was a lot there to absorb, but can you identify for us whether or if there is sort of one standard suite of sports betting laws that have been more frequently adopted by states versus others? I mean, is there a trend? You mentioned Connecticut a couple times in your presentation. So is there something like a sister state that sort of, naturally, either geographically or based on our sort of history and tradition of laws, Vermont would sort of look to, that's sort of predominant in the space? And then there's like a minority of states in another camp. I mean, I'm just trying to sort through, generally speaking. I know there are variations in each one, but do you have a sense of that?
So as far as the kind of suite of laws, that's the reason that I highlighted the casinos up front, because broadly the gaming control board model is absolutely the most common model.
Yeah.
Through licensure. That is the model that is being used in 2/3 of the states that are operating. And they all have very similar laws with some nuances there. There's states with riverboat gambling, and that's where all of the sports wagering is taking place. So it's very specific to their riverboats, but the gambling control board model is the most common. As far as regional examples, as it turns out, the Northeast, and I'll use the Northeast to mean New England plus New York, and we can talk about Pennsylvania and New Jersey separately. But the Northeast is primarily on the state control side of things. And perhaps the most similar state that you could take a look at, and I highlight them only because I took a look at states where sports wagering is being offered, but there aren't either there aren't casinos or there isn't a huge volume of casino action, and that was New Hampshire. So Connecticut, another control state, but they control through their two Tiverton casinos, Twin River Tiverton casinos. New York has a hybrid model with an aspect of state control that includes a competitive bidding process. And then as we move south, if you're talking about the kind of greater Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, New Jersey and Pennsylvania are gaming control board states. They were the first out of the gate casino states. And conceptually in 2018, what those states were very concerned with, driving consumers to casinos. You'll notice casinos were the primary licensees in those states. Early on, there were requirements for, in-person presence and in-person registration. Nevada even did that initially, requiring in-person registration in order to do online sports wagering. So that's the balance, I would say, in our region broadly.
Last question I had, have any states, and I was intrigued by the kind of range of activities, sporting activities that could be bet on, right? The Gatorade dump and things of that nature, in-game changes that happen that might affect outcomes, or player statistics that were referenced earlier. I mean, have any states ever looked at simply saying, sports betting should be restricted to betting on the outcome of the sporting event itself? So it's like the games are what's at issue. People want to bet on a winner, a loser, maybe a tie, things of that nature. But getting into the minutia of, a boxing match and how many punches might be thrown in a given round, just kind of, you can theoretically come up with anything in the context of a game that might happen, how many runs versus how many passes in a football game, things of that nature. Has anybody just said like, hey, we're getting into this area, but before we go down the road of, I think Senator Rom Hinsdale mentioned, like, you could just bet on literally anything that's happening, and there's just a menu that is almost endless, which might contribute to addictive tendencies or kind of getting out of control with the individual, kind of not having any sort of self-restraint, or getting swept up in something, and pretty soon the losses are just piling up. I'm wondering about that. It's like I don't know, for a lot of people, the interest in sports betting is like on the outcome of the event itself, right? And that seems like a pretty limited universe, but it seems like a very expansive universe of what we're sort of talking about here.
So yes, there are states that have chosen to limit the types of bets that can be placed. No, to my knowledge, there are not states that say exclusively you bet on the outcome of the event. I'll go back and look. I'll hesitate for a moment and go back and look through the definitions of sports wagering that I included in the report for each state and see whether there are any, but immediately I say no, there aren't any that strictly use outcome. And the influence there, Christopher, is fantasy football. And there's a lot of studies that have looked at how the sports wagering market has matured and what the impact of interest in fantasy sports contests and fantasy football has been, because it has driven consumer attention to things like how many passes will be thrown in the first quarter, how many receptions will this wide receiver have in the game, right? There's a lot of attention from consumers on those things, and that drives the liquidity of the market, the consumer interest, right? So the operators have tended toward offering on their platform some sort of, minute contingency bets that are included. Will Patrick Mahomes throw 4 touchdowns in the game on Sunday? Questions like that. So I'll look back and see if there are any outcome exclusive states. I can tell you that Delaware was, when it was restricted by PASPA and their lottery games, because the games that they offered before the prohibition started were exclusively lottery games where the predicted outcomes and margins in each game were listed on a lottery ticket, and you picked 6 games that you thought were going to come out with those outcomes and submitted your lottery ticket, and that was your sports wager. But that's the only example that comes to mind.
Thanks.
The reason I asked that was simply because if memory serves, and I certainly don't want to speak for industry or for the platforms, but if memory serves, I think at the time there was some acknowledgement or representation that fantasy sports were a little different than traditional gambling because it was more of a game of skill. You really had to know like the whole lineup from top to bottom, and you had to study or have a general awareness of kind of where you thought players would go over the course of a season. And so the ultimate end of a team in a league where there might be, monies at issue. There was more to it than simply just taking a guess. Is one player going to demonstrate one course of conduct during one particular game, which seems a little more arguably, one might say, well, that's a little bit more just in the nature of chance. Because how could you possibly predict, in one given game versus over the course of a season, kind of how things might factor out in the context of a team that you've created for purposes of fantasy sports. So I don't know, I could just imagine discussion along those lines. And so that was the reason for my question. But thank you. More to think through and discuss for sure.
Thank you, Chris. Do you have any other questions, Chris, at this point? I think Deputy Secretary Brooks has a question or has his hand raised. Tate.
Thank you. Tucker, I was just wondering, I know there's been some discussion, obviously, I think Senator Sears at the last meeting kind of indicated, he runs into people who venture over to Massachusetts or to New York State because of where he's kind of located out of. I'm just curious if there's any additional information in regards to border states, in regards to northern borders, as far as Canadian borders. So I'm just curious whether it be, Michigan with the Detroit-Windsor connection, or Seattle, or the state of Washington. I'm just kind of curious if we have any information between Canada-US border states.
Yes, there's information out there that I can share with you. And the most recent studies look at the legalization of sports wagering in Ontario, because the market was introduced during the NHL season when the Toronto Maple Leafs were doing very well. And I think it had a big launch during the season. So there was a lot of attention drawn to it and a lot of studies done. And part of that may be are people crossing the border to get into Ontario. I can't remember if Quebec has sports wagering, but maybe we can find a study for you about how many people drive north to get into Quebec and wager. I'm sure there are studies about how many people cross the border for casinos in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you.
Would the platforms possibly have that in their geodata? Can you share that with us? What kind of cross-border migration might be?
They might. I would assume that they have a ton of really great, likely proprietary data. So you should ask them if they're willing to share with you.
I'm not asking for the whole thing, just a taste. Yeah.
Any other specific questions for Tucker on the presentation? I know we're going to have a lot of questions.
Oh, God.
Right. I mean, I guess that's sort of where I would. Senator Sears, do you have a question?
I actually do, and it may sound kind of odd, but do states allow betting on auto racing? And it's the only thing I can think of somewhat professional in Vermont. I'm probably missing some, but we do have professional auto racing at Barry Thunder Road and other things. I'm just thinking the governor betting on the governor or whatever. It's just an odd situation. Do those states allow betting on racing, auto racing?
Yes, there are states that allow betting on auto racing.
Now, New Hampshire, the way they've done it, they have, NASCAR races and so forth. Do they allow that there, or is that through their draft?
I would have to go back and look through some of my New Hampshire materials to see whether they excluded or included auto racing. I can't remember off the top of my head.
And Senator Sears, we are planning on having some representatives from New Hampshire to come be a guest speaker, as you call it. And based on your conversation, this presentation, Tucker, I think we should also reach out to someone in Connecticut and have someone from Connecticut as well. But we can follow up on that. Senator Sears, did you have any other questions at the moment besides that?
That's pretty thorough.
Yeah.
Really.
So I guess I would like to have the committee talk about, are there other policy questions or decisions that come to mind that are not on Tucker's presentation? That would be, and you don't have the answer right now, it'd be nice to think about, but I'd like to have a discussion like this. I think provides a really good framework for doing a deep dive. And that's kind of the plan over the course of a few weeks and months. I keep saying weeks, but it really is it's sort of months, not really, but we're going to go deeper into some of these policy decisions. So are there anything based on this conversation, anything that come to mind that are not identified as like a key policy decision or a decision, a key policy point? So that would be the first question. Anything jump out for anyone that's not discussed here? I guess then I would want to talk about, are there decisions we can make now or directions we can make now based on some of the information that's presented and some of the thoughts we had and discussions we had? For example, when I look at the primary decision slide, Tucker outlines, are we going to be a prohibitionist state? Do we want to be a state control, or do we want to be a license model? I think based on our last discussion at our first meeting, we'd already decided as a group that we were intending to be here to get us to how, not if. So if that's the case, then I would suggest that we take off as one of the items of the primary decision is we are agreed that we're not going to be a prohibitionist state. Is that correct? Does that make sense to everybody? So now we're just going to be deciding, do we want to be a control state or a licensed state, and all of those secondary decisions that Tucker outlined. Does that make sense?
I concur, yes.
Okay. Then I guess I would look at, so then Tucker has these great slides. We have a state, control state, a license market. I think that bears a deeper dive at another meeting to really kind of talk through that, the pros and the cons, getting our guest speakers and our experts that can help us with that. Then I start looking at the secondary decisions. Again, we're going to need a lot of conversation about this. Is there anything on these slides or these points of decisions that we feel we could get a direction on, or do we have some points that we would like to identify at this point? Represented by Rob.
Putting this into effect, stage one, I personally would feel comfortable with. Online and mobile, I don't love the idea of hard infrastructure or retail.
I was going to say something similar. I just would need to be convinced that we need to move in that direction pretty heavily. And that feels like a lot of time that would have to be spent on something that isn't in Vermont's current culture.
The retail market.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We don't have a robust gaming culture of like OTBs, things of that nature, sports books. So I don't see the need to really actively pursue that in this first phase.
Okay.
The only thing, so I didn't feel like this was the Tucker question, but I also don't know if I just want the industry to answer this question, but I was starting to wonder about what like a hybrid event looks like at Buffalo Wild Wings, where people are gathered to watch one event and they're kind of betting in community, like social licensing or something. I imagine I imagine that. I can visualize that, I imagine people bet in some social setting. And I don't know if that is, we're talking online mobile and there's just special licenses to do like an in-person social event.
I can say, as the Commissioner of the Department of Liquor and Lottery,
Yeah.
that betting is not currently allowed in
Okay.
bars and restaurants.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's not to say we
Yeah.
couldn't allow it.
And that's the thing is like, when you're on the platform, right? Like,
Right.
how would you prohibit that activity within the bar, right? How would you monitor that and really effectuate the governance of it, right? Like, how would you enforce that as people are?
Exactly. I'm talking about
that's what
in person.
yeah.
If you're talking about a hybrid model.
I wasn't talking about a retail purchase option, but I was trying to picture the like kind of community that somebody like DraftKings is trying to create where they sponsor like an NFL night somewhere and like.
Oh, I get where you're going right now. I get where you're going right now.
I don't know what that is.
Like promotional events,
But
right?
also
yes.
people would be maybe gambling in the same space in a bar. Like you can't stop that. So I'm just trying to picture
of
what
course.
that is.
So now I see what you're saying. It's like,
Yeah.
like,
Is there a name for that, like a social
Yeah, do
event?
we restrict the ability? That's
Yeah.
more of like a promotional event by one of the vendors.
Probably.
Yes.
All right.
And do we restrict those promotional events by vendors? And just
Yeah.
let the personal activity within the device and the individual happen? Yes.
So that would be a question, I think, for the operators, which is the kind of promotional events that they might do to bring people on premise somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Just for the purpose of a community and fan engagement.
Yes. Where you're only using digital
Online,
purchasing
right.
options.
Yes. And then it's like, what do we allow for marketing and brand exposure in an environment like that?
Yeah.
Correct. So going back to then, does the group feel a consensus that we, at this point, really want to focus on the online mobile wagering and how to do that and not pursue a retail model where we're doing OTB and kiosk and physical locations?
I would defer, I defer to the policy makers, on that specific question. I don't know that the Attorney General's office has a particular position on that. I do think that to the point that Senator Rom Hinsdale and, was just raising about, gatherings, there is a question in my mind about the advertising that might go. You could imagine local places saying, come on down to our restaurant for Thursday night betting and watching of the game, right? And there's a question in my mind about, does Vermont, as a matter of policy and in terms of the marketing piece, there's a little consumer protection question there around like, what's the representation being made and how ubiquitous do we want the message to be that gambling is sort of fostered, encouraged, and actively supported by our local businesses. That's a separate question from, I think Representative Byron was making about, yes, of course you can get together in a bar or a restaurant and do it yourselves on your own handheld devices. But the promotion of it and the marketing of it, that does raise an interesting question. It's separate from whether they're licensed to do that activity, but it's just more, can they be promoting it? So I agree that's worth additional consideration.
Yes.
Yeah. Senator Sears?
I agree with what's been said to this extent, except that you would have groups betting at the local sports bar.
Right.
You do have already, they'll be using their mobile phones, I assume. So they're going to be doing it anyway.
Doing it. They actually are already doing it.
Right. So,
Right.
but I do have it's kind of, we go to a store, buy a lottery ticket in Vermont. Why wouldn't we allow certain venues to do that? Before we close that option on, maybe we should hear a little bit about that.
Absolutely.
It is sort of like off off track betting where I can go down to the local grocery store, buy any lottery ticket or Powerball ticket or whatever. I do that in person. I don't do that online.
Valid point. I'm just trying to understand like where we want to go.
The lottery commission would be running it, and we wouldn't set up a new gaming. Anyway, that's just a.
Okay. So you don't, at this point, you want to exclude the evaluation of whether or not we should have a retail model? You think it's worth?
Yeah, I'd like to hear more about other states and, our own model here. Maybe it wouldn't be every grocery store, but maybe some.
Okay. So then I guess I'm looking at kind of the secondary decisions. We definitely, organizing and balancing the state interests. Can we have a little conversation about what we all feel the state's interests are right now that would be balanced? I'm hearing a lot about maximizing revenue and protecting consumers.
And as Tucker said, making sure this captures what is otherwise illicit and illegal.
Right.
I was just reading about California and marijuana and how
Right.
there's still so much illegal activity. Yes. Nothing changed, so.
Oh, in the cannabis market?
Yeah.
So then conversion of the illicit market, we feel is a priority, consumer protections priority, and revenue is a priority. I'm looking at Tucker's slide. So we've identified those three. The other two that he's identified are fan engagement and support for in-state or regional franchises, and then establishing strong and responsive administrative authority. Any sense of whether any of those two are a priority for our work in terms of where we go in terms of direction and what we look at?
I think we should focus more on the administrative authority. I mean, fan engagement, in my mind, that's a little bit more, but that's also like, are we going to operate it as the state ourselves? Are we going to license out? So the fan engagement is on the operator with us providing regulatory oversight guidance.
And what I heard from Tucker is that obviously the operator revenue is the state revenue. So you want to make sure that you are not inadvertently making decisions that are going to limit state operator revenue, right? If you don't need to, because that limits state revenue. And so I guess what I heard from him on the fan engagement is that is a way for the operators to create more handle, basically. But to your point, Representative Byron, does that need to be a priority for us? If we're trying to look at what are our state interests and what do we want to focus on, is that a priority? Representative Byron. What? Need to be a priority for us. If we're trying to look at what are our state interests and what do we want to focus on?
Join the meeting.
That was weird.
That was our other member who had to switch to a phone, and I've muted him now.
Cool.
Okay.
I'm just going to add to the list of state interests. One is not losing Vermonters to other states.
Not losing.
That being me not going to New York.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
It's like more illicit than illegal. What I read into with the responsive administrative authority is like just giving the entities that are regulating the system nimbleness and flexibility and not having a lot of return to the legislature to make decisions. So making sure that we're conscious of what we're delegating out and what we're requiring for legislative decision making. And I would err on the side of delegating out, and except where we see, but having a responsive administration to us as well, problems that we should be aware of each year.
Authority.
Yeah,
yes.
right.
Yeah, and as one of the administrative agencies, I would concur that that makes sense to give, as the legislative body, to give the administrative agency some opportunity to be responsive and nimble. Do we think then, so not losing Vermont to New York State and Massachusetts, that feels like a really important point. I wonder if that's part of the conversion of the illegal / illicit market. That would make sense. Okay, I feel like we have some direction there. So we started talking about the next slide is establishing administrative authority. Again, we're going to go into the deep dives here. I'm just trying to get a sense of, based on the conversations, based on the policy matrix and the presentation that Tucker gave us, are we feeling that we're going can we exclude some options? Are we going down a certain path in the interest of really going in the deep dives of the things that we want to explore? So I look at establishing administrative authority, and to your point, Representative Byron, do we want to be a state control model or do we want to be a licensed market? I think it would be really useful to have some folks come in and talk about that and sort of a hybrid. I know what I heard from you, Tucker, when you really talk about the license market, something for us to keep in mind is that those tend to be entities, states that have a history of racetrack and casino gaming. And knowing that Vermont doesn't, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
Does that lean us toward a state control model in some way? Or do we still want to understand, for example, Massachusetts that has a lot of casinos, do we need to understand kind of the lessons learned from a licensed market, given the fact that we don't have this history of casinos and racetracks?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't have that existing infrastructure of already having a gaming board. Yeah. So did you mention something, Tucker, in here? I have a note about with a state control model, yes, it's state control, but you license out through the state control to the entities that bid essentially contract work, right?
Yes, and I can give you an example from each version. So Oregon operates a lottery. They operate sports wagering through their lottery, but they very recently adopted administrative rules also allowing the lottery explicitly to offer DraftKings. So DraftKings is now operating a platform on behalf of the Oregon lottery to provide sports wagering in the state. On the state control side, with the exclusive franchise model, what is essentially happening in that particular model is that the state contracts with a bidding entity. So in New Hampshire, that was DraftKings. I can't remember who got the contracts with the casinos in Rhode Island. That's a hybrid state control model. But the state puts out a bid like it would put out a bidding process for who's going to work on the state house heating system. And then based on criteria and guidelines established ahead of time and a combination of statute and rule, they determine based on a point system. And I can point you to documents that were used by New Hampshire for their point system, and then New York, which had a very detailed point system. They pick essentially the highest bidder that's going to return the best revenue to the state. And then everything's controlled by the franchise agreement and any rules and prohibitions and statute that can define how the operator behaves in the state.
Thanks, Tucker. So when we look at the establishing administrative authority, are there initial thoughts? Again, we're going to get into a deep dive of all this, but based on what we're hearing from Tucker, did we have a sense of centralized versus decentralized administrative authority? Just again, we don't have to have a decision made today, but just to think about, as Tucker mentioned, that the problem gambling might be done by a separate entity. It might be funded through a sports betting apparatus, like we had talked about, a certain percentage of the revenue or the profit would go towards problem gambling or responsible gaming, and what entity takes on that. I will share that the model we have now for the lottery problem gaming is that as Tucker mentioned, there's a contract, I think it's about $150,000, and it goes to a nonprofit entity. And we can get more into kind of responsible gaming and problem gambling. I think there's a lot of more effective ways that we can address that. And I don't think a 1-800 number based on the information we're getting, if we think about sports betting, people are on their phones. So they're not going to call.
Different.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really good conversation about when we get into the responsible gaming and problem gambling isn't it better to have pop-up ads like Tucker's talking about, pop-up notices that come on and not a 1-800 model? Do we have, the health department doesn't actually provide services. They can refer people to addiction counselors. So I definitely think that there's some good experience we have in terms of what's not working. It's not on sports betting. And I think that we want to definitely have the National Council of Problem Gambling come in, and for example, Massachusetts has a gaming and health entity. And I think that they can provide good resources for us. Yes.
I'd also like to see the Agency of Education and the Secretary of State's office. And let's see what they can do with financial literacy K to 12. Or K actually right through colleges. Maybe we can pay for some really good curriculum development.
Okay, you're talking about where the revenues get directed from sports betting?
But I'm also talking about the lottery model being an 800 number, being more proactive.
Yes.
Let's get this going in the schools. And then the new 988 number that is for mental health counseling. Well, that's another 800 number, but still, maybe instead of reinventing the wheel, when people call the 988 number, they might be referred within that. So.
Okay.
This just leads to, we're already going to hear from New Hampshire, so I'd like to ask them what they do. They're just a small state as well. So knowing what they do, I think is helpful. And two, I don't know who this contract is with the state. I think we had the National Association of Problem Gambling in to speak to our committee, and they gave us a lot of thoughts on how to regulate our system. But maybe we should have, whoever we give money to now, maybe we should have them in to better understand if that's working at all. I don't know if you talked to them. Like, how does this work?
Yeah.
We've had testimony in the past.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who
More
are
around
they?
lotto though, more around
Right.
lotto. This is like addictive gaming with scratch offs and things of that nature.
But that's the group we give money to. You have them come in.
Correct. They're the Howard Center.
It's the Howard Center.
Oh, it's the Howard.
Yeah.
We subcontract
okay.
with Howard, yeah.
Okay.
It's a pretty meager budget.
Yeah, they have 150,000.
Right, but what I will share is that it's not effective at addressing.
Right.
It's not proactive. And so I've been having active conversations with the health department and the chief prevention officer and the team internally about how to be proactive. As you're talking about, Representative Odie, we need to be thinking differently than carving out a grant and giving it to.
Yeah. No, I would want whatever entities involved to be pointing things out to us about regulating the system, not just, having 150,000 to that.
And I see this as broader under financial literacy, not just a gambling thing, but what happens to money that you save, what happens to money if you gamble, what are the odds? So you're really talking about a lot, how to save for college, all of it. Financial literacy.
That's a great point.
I'm flying off the rails a little bit right now with what you're saying. So it's like there's also the gamification of some of the apps these days, Robinhood, whatnot, with how people are treating like stock market and cryptocurrency investments. It's the same sort of game interface as these. It's almost like they have the same developers. They really do. So there might be an ability to hit all of those sort of like how are you calculating your risk with your money?
Right. I mean, I would take it a step further, which is social media literacy. Like right now, all of these apps are based on bells and whistles and things that pull you back in. Like it's a complete digital literacy issue.
And we have the chance here with revenue, a new revenue source. To do something big.
Yep.
And that also plays into how to evaluate what is being said in the public realm on social media.
Excellent. I like that. How are we doing on timing? Good. So balancing statute and administrative rules, that's something we talked about in the Senate Economic Development Committee. I think that was in the interest of time, right? Speed to market, what was it? Speed to market? Yeah. And thank you, Tucker. You're still with us. Thank you, Tucker. So I think we want to think through that. Like the question becomes, how much do you want to put in statute and how much do you want to refer to administrative rules? And you giving that flexibility. So we need to think about that and then come to some agreement about what we're comfortable with recommending in terms of what needs to be in statute versus what can be identified in administrative rules.
Administrative rules is not a quick, nimble process. So what might be interim steps to take? That would not mean a full rulemaking process. And I don't know. Maybe I want to hear about that.
Tucker, can you talk a little bit about that? Because that was something we worked on last session.
So I'll share two sides of this from the two different perspectives. The first in the state control model. The proposal in Senate Economic Development was actually to allow the Department of Liquor and Lottery to adopt guidelines, which is a shorter process under the Administrative Procedures Act than full rulemaking. And I can share with the committee, I made a spreadsheet that ranked the states and how fast they were through their rulemaking process. And the fastest states, at least on that side of the ledger, all shortened the rulemaking timeline or had rules in place by the time PASPA was overturned by the Supreme Court. So the fastest state ever was New Jersey. It was 2 days after PASPA was overturned because everything was in place. The governor signed a bill, the rules went into effect 2 days later. Then on the licensure side, you had states get creative with interim or initial licenses. And the example that was brought to the Senate committee, I think it was by the SBA, the Sports Betting Alliance, was Wyoming. And what Wyoming did is to kind of cut through the qualification process and increase that speed to market. They had the rulemaking process set up so that full rules would be adopted. And in the interim, they allowed entities to enter the market provided they were licensed and qualified in at least 3 other states. And that allowed the market to get stood up very quickly. And in Wyoming, it was somewhere between 80 to 120 days before everything was in place for the market to operate. So those are the two examples that I'll provide of how things can be accelerated.
I guess the final point on your slide, Tucker, here is existing versus new structures. Maybe some of the conversations and discussions will illuminate that a little bit more about whether or not we have existing resources or existing divisions or agencies, or whether there's something new within those agencies or separate that needs to be established. So, for example, in other states that have casinos and racetracks, there's a gaming commission, Do we need a gaming commission? Is that the kind of model that we're looking at? Or, do we have a sports betting unit within the Department of Liquor and Lottery, as an example? Or what are some of those resources for problem gambling? So more on that. And then the intent is that there will be, a complete kind of conversation focused on some of these other points of discussion or policy. So we will have consumer protections. We definitely want to get into that quite a bit. I think that will come about when we have the National Council on Problem Gaming and some of those consumer protection groups. I think that Curtis, you could be really helpful in terms of identifying some of the questions that you might have and some of the other entities that we might want to have give us some information. I know it's something that the operators can talk about in terms of what some of the consumer protections they put in place, particularly self-regulating, those sort of guardrails. And then I know that the other states will be able to give us their lessons learned too on consumer protections. Chris, did you want to join in?
The only other thing I would note there is a desire to either, just to factor in the existing fantasy sports consumer protection regulated outline that already exists. And so either thinking about parity, and maybe many of those elements could be brought into whatever's going to function here, in addition to perhaps some other ones, because I think there are other interesting issues around, pop-ups or limiting to only certain types of gaming, that kind of thing. But certainly I think you'd want parity there in some sense, so that those universes don't look totally alien to one another, because they're touching on very similar kinds of activities. So we ought to be thinking about that. Or if wholesale reform is needed, then we maybe need to be looking back at the fantasy sports consumer protection outline and thinking, okay, if there needs to be amendment there as a result of what we're learning through this process, we should be thinking about that, or lawmakers could be thinking about that. So that just might be, I'm just flagging that because I'm just mindful that lawmakers have been down this road, at least with a narrow aspect of this universe. And so we should just be thinking about making sure that these are not totally alien to one another.
So Chris, maybe at one of our upcoming meetings, it sounds like it might be worthwhile to give it, if you could give an overview perhaps of those fantasy sports consumer protections so that we're aware of them. I think that would be really useful.
Happy to do that at the next meeting. Yep. I actually brought the list with me today, but we won't have time. So I want to make sure that, you get to everything else today.
I think that would be really helpful. On taxes, we definitely want to really look at, what kind of tax model we want? Do we want a revenue share? If we're looking to, going back to the goals, what are we trying to accomplish? What are our priorities? And that would be, maximizing revenue, or bringing in revenue to the state and making sure that we have consumer protections and bringing in that illegal market, for example. Then we would want to look at the pros and cons. And I think that we do have one of our upcoming meetings will have someone from JFO kind of walk us through that tax revenue matrix. And I think, John, this is where you could be helpful if you're still with us, John. I think you could be helpful in terms of, do you see I'm giving everyone homework right now? You could be helpful in terms of helping us kind of understand that, because, if you put a certain tax rate in statute, like some of the states have done, and I think Wyoming, for example, was one, versus doing a revenue share. And as Representative Byron was asking earlier, like, what is that revenue based on? Is it based on gross revenue? Is it based on net revenue? One of the things that I learned during the legislative session is that Wyoming Tucker talked about these offsets. And one of the things they did, they had a number of operators, and then they had all these offsets, including the promotions and the advertising. They ended up with zero revenue the first year. And that struck me as something we want to avoid, I think. So whatever they did, I think we should dissect a little, because we don't want to end up with zero revenue. That would kind of defeat the purpose of the work that we're doing. So I think really looking at how to structure the revenue share versus taxes would be really important.
And while we're having that conversation too, I mean, I'd like to structure it. We're going to be the last to market with our abutting neighbors. And I don't want to see Vermonters in border communities going over the border because they get a better deal.
Yep.
I'd rather reverse the flow to us being an attractive gaming market if we're really basing this on platform-based wagering. You know, how do we get someone from the Berkshires to drive into Bennington as opposed to someone in Bennington driving to the Berkshires?
I feel like I'm still stuck on whether or not we get the tax revenue if someone is traveling.
If you are a Vermonter and you bet in Massachusetts, they get the tax.
They get the revenue. That's why we want to keep
That's
betting in
the
Vermont
geofencing.
or have betting in.
Okay. That's
Yes, Representative Odie.
I would like to see, before we are super concerned about the loss of revenue at the border, I'd like to see a lot of data, like where are the people living right now who are betting? And what, if most of it happens in the interior of the state and people would not be necessarily driving out, then maybe the border towns are not the focus. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm trying to, so right now, sports betting is not legal in Vermont. So, right, so presumably what's happening is people are going to Massachusetts and New York and New Hampshire because they can't place a bet in Vermont.
Well, Mass is almost up and running, and I'm really interested to see, because New Hampshire was early in the market, right? But a lot of their gaming is actually, a significant percentage is people from Massachusetts driving over to bet in New Hampshire.
Then
So I want to see also, I also want to see
Yeah.
what happens when Massachusetts is going online too. I want to see how that hits the New Hampshire revenue as an example of like, what are you truly going to capture from outside markets to inside markets?
Good.
And how do we retain the Vermonters who are gaming in this way? You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
I totally agree, but I also want to add that, you can bet in Vermont using offshore.
Right.
That too.
Criteria.
Yes.
That's, I haven't figured out exactly how you get your money back from Nigeria, but
Yes, that is not FDIC insured.
Right.
Yes.
We actually are going to have someone in Vermont come in, a consumer basically, and talk to us about his experience. It is a he, so I'll say that. Okay, and then we talked a lot about responsible gaming, and that'll be a really, I feel like a real focus of ours too, to really make sure that we look at how to do this, that we're really protecting consumers, being responsible. And this is where I think, Tucker, you were talking about kind of our values, right? What are our institutional values? And how do we manifest this in the work that we're doing? We're doing really well with time. We have 5 minutes, so I'm going to pause for a second. Any other points of policy discussions or people or entities we would like to see come in and give us, presentations, answer our questions? We talked about Connecticut. We're having a consumer perspective. We definitely want to go through the tax and the revenue. We talked about having other states with lesson learned. Senator Sears, you had recommended James Pepper from the Cannabis Control Board. When we look at one of our priorities is going from an illicit or illegal market to a regulated market. He's happy to come in. He will be, going through the lessons learned. So if there's any other thoughts we had on who might be helpful, we don't have to necessarily answer today, but think about that. And Mike's been scheduling that.
I mean, I just hope it's conveyed to the platforms representatives when they come in. Like, I personally really need a visualization, like we're playing a game.
Right.
I'm having to, this is just out of my wheelhouse in terms of when do pop-ups
You want to play
come up.
toys. I want to see all the pop-ups happen. I want to see all the,
I have the same thing.
A demo.
Right.
Yeah, Mike is working on getting a demo. We'll have a demo.
Okay.
Someone literally showing it.
Yeah, it can't be like a PowerPoint, like it needs to be.
Your PowerPoint wasn't a
Realistic.
PowerPoint, Tucker, but it was
No,
fabulous.
that was fine, but just
No,
different
agreed.
than these games.
All
that are-
day.
Yeah. Great. Any other thoughts or questions before we conclude?
Can we just, like, a half an hour makes a huge difference and all of a sudden this meeting became 11:30. I just don't know. Are we always doing 11:30 to 1:30? Is that?
What's your preference?
I don't know. I had just put it from 12 to 2 because we just didn't set. Are we doing 11:30 to 1:30?
We set 11:30 to 1:30.
They're not showing up on my calendar from Mike.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to make sure I do it myself.
We talked about midday. If that doesn't work, let me know, but we have it 11:30 to 1:30.
Mike, did you send a calendar invite for September 27th? And I just didn't get it. I'm just trying to understand what's happening.
I did send it around Hinsdale and I can send it back to you again.
Could you? Because I don't know why I got this one and not, like, I have half of them. I have ones in November, but like not September.
I think I had the same issue, actually. I should take a look. I think maybe we should look.
Okay. I don't know.
For some reason, I also.
So we agreed that,
calendar.
a couple hours every other week. I think we continue with that, see how far we get. If 11:30 to 1:30 doesn't work, we'll revisit. If we need to, as we move further along, if we have more questions and need more information, we can always add another meeting. But for now, I think we'll move along and let me know if there's any problems. Me or Mike. Good. All right. Excellent. I really appreciate everyone's time and attention. This was really a great discussion. And if
Great
there's
sharing.
no other questions or comments, I think